August 15th, 1942. Midday sun scorched the steel deck of the USS West Point as it carried its cargo eastward across the Pacific. Not ammunition, not food, human cargo. 672 Japanese prisoners of war captured in the jungles of Guadalcanal, crammed into the ship's belly. They had been told by their officers that capture meant humiliation worse than death, that the Americans would line them up, slit their throats, burn their bodies as refuse. They had been told that dishonor would stain not only themselves, but their families for generations. And so, when the steel hatches slammed shut and the echo of boots clattered overhead, most of the prisoners sat in silence, waiting for the cruelty to begin. The first sound was not the crack of rifles or the rattle of chains. It was something soft, impossible to place at first, a hiss, a trickle, then a clatter of metal against metal. Sergeant Yamashita, wedged against the bulkhead, thought it was steam escaping from pipes until the air filled with the scent of rice. American guards appeared at the hatch, their boots thudding on the ladder. They did not carry whips or bayonets. They carried ladles and trays steaming with food, rice, meat, vegetables, hot coffee poured into tin mugs. The prisoners stared in disbelief. For men who had been surviving on half-rotted fish and fist-sized lumps of barley, the trays seemed like hallucinations. Yamashita braced himself, certain it was a trick, that the food was poisoned, that the guards would laugh as the Japanese collapsed, choking on the deck. Yet when the first man bit in, trembling, eyes darting, nothing happened except that he ate and ate and ate, until tears ran down his cheeks. The silence of dread was broken by the scrape of spoons, the sound of chewing, and then something no one expected. Laughter, low at first, then louder, a sound these men had not heard in months of jungle fighting. They were supposed to be animals in cages, treated as less than human. Yet here they were, chewing meat too rich for their stomachs, drinking coffee that burned their tongues, staring at guards who gave them seconds without mockery. By the time the ship reached San Francisco, the prisoners had already begun whispering in disbelief. They don't starve us. They give us blankets. They treat us like soldiers. The dock cranes loomed over the bay, unloading crates, swinging barrels, and beyond the piers, the prisoners glimpsed something their leaders had never described. A city alive with cars, lights, and steel bridges that cut across the sky. Not barbarism, not cruelty. Supremacy, yes, but of a kind utterly alien to the propaganda they had been raised on. From the ship to the trains, from the trains to the barbed wire compounds of Wisconsin, Colorado, and Texas, the revelations kept coming. For Lieutenant Shiru Kado, the breaking point came the first night in camp. He lay awake on his cot, certain that the kindness was a mask, that in the dark the guards would slip in and begin the punishment. He listened for boots, for the rattle of a rifle bolt being drawn. Instead, he heard something else, the faint crackle of a radio. Music drifted from the guard station, not military marches, not drums of war, a woman's voice lilting in smooth singing of love. It was the first night in months he allowed his eyes to close without clutching his stomach in hunger. The enemy he had been taught to fear had sung him to sleep. And so began the transformation, not in speeches, not in surrender documents, but in simple daily revelations. The rifle had broken them in battle. The camp would unmake their fear. The story of how men who once swore to kill Americans without hesitation learned to smile at them, laugh with them, even trust them, begins here in the long, hot summer of 1942, when the war they thought they understood was stripped away by an unexpected kindness more disarming than any bullet. The barbed wire fence stood 12 feet high, 3 rolls deep, topped with steel coils that caught the sunlight. For the men inside, it was supposed to symbolize captivity. Yet within weeks of arrival, many of the prisoners no longer saw it that way. On the first morning in Wisconsin, Shiru Kado woke to the sharp crack of a whistle. He thought it was an order for punishment drill, the kind imperial officers had used to drive exhausted conscripts through endless marches. Instead, the whistle meant breakfast. Rows of prisoners shuffled into the mess hall. The smell of eggs and bread hit them like artillery. Plates clattered, trays slid down counters, butter melted across toast. Yamashita whispered to Kado, "They feed us more than we had in the jungle." Kado did not answer. His mind was fixed on the absurdity. Their own men back home rationed to thin rice gruel. Yet here, in the heart of enemy land, prisoners ate like laborers before a harvest. Some refused at first, believing poison would follow. They watched Americans eat from the same kitchens, the same bread, the same steaming coffee. Slowly, suspicion gave way to appetite. Within days, men who had fought at Tenaru and the Matanikau were eating 3 meals a day until their belts needed new holes. The camp routine was rigid, but never cruel. Work began after breakfast, clearing brush, tending gardens, repairing fences. Men used to hacking through mangrove swamps and choking on malaria air now swung axes through Wisconsin pines, the smell of sap filling their lungs. The guards watched but rarely barked orders. The rhythm was steady, human, and for men who had expected shackles, there was a strange freedom in labor that wasn't accompanied by hunger or terror. But the first true shock came on Sunday. The bell rang in the distance, carried by wind. A line of prisoners gathered near the gate, curious. Across the fields, white wooden buildings rose, churches. Townsfolk filed in with hymn books tucked under their arms. Children in their best clothes skipped up the steps, their laughter ringing clear. The guards explained through interpreters. Those who wished could attend service, listen to music, or remain in camp. No punishment either way. The idea was inconceivable. In the Imperial Army, religion was duty. Here it was choice. Kado went half in defiance, half in curiosity. Inside he saw rows of Americans bowing their heads, not to an emperor, but to a god he had only heard of in whispers. And then the organ began to play. The sound filled the air like nothing he had heard since boyhood. Not a battle hymn, but a song that made the walls vibrate with warmth. Some prisoners wept openly. They were not sure why, perhaps because the music did not sound like victory or defeat, but like home. As weeks became months, the layers of fear peeled away in small moments. A guard passing out cigarettes without mockery. A farmer thanking a prisoner for fixing his fence. Children pointing at them from beyond the wire, curious but never hateful. At night, the camps glowed with a different kind of revelation. Projectors whirred, screens lit up, and suddenly men who had never seen a moving picture watched shadows dance into life. Cowboy films, comedies, American soldiers laughing at the same jokes they were watching. For Yamashita, who had expected torture, the sight of guards and prisoners chuckling side by side felt like a hallucination. "Do you think," he whispered to Kado, "that they are showing us these films to mock us?" Kado shook his head. "No, they are showing us who they are." And who they were was not the demon image drawn in Japanese propaganda leaflets. These were people who worked, ate, prayed, and laughed. People who inexplicably treated prisoners with a dignity they rarely afforded each other in battle. Letters began to arrive. Prisoners were allowed to write home. At first, most hesitated, ashamed to confess survival. But when the first replies came, mothers relieved their sons were alive. Wives writing of children born during the war, the shame cracked. Men realized their families did not despise them for being captured. They were grateful. The guards noticed something too. The prisoners began to walk differently. The bowed shoulders of defeat slowly straightened. Laughter returned in the barracks. Men who had once muttered about escape stopped glancing at the fences. The barbed wire no longer looked like a cage. It looked like a border between two worlds, and life on the inside was safer than anything waiting beyond. Evenings turned into debates. Prisoners gathered around tables discussing what they saw. "If this is how they treat their enemies," one said, "how do they treat their friends?" Another muttered. No wonder they fight so hard. They are not starving. It became clear to Cato that something profound was happening. The Americans had not broken them with brutality. They had dismantled their fear with generosity. The Garand rifle had crushed their bodies on the battlefield, but it was butter on toast, laughter in the dark, and kindness without demand that dismantled their hatred. The irony was bitter. In America's hands, they discovered more humanity than they had often been allowed in their own army. And as months turned to years, the transformation deepened. By 1943, men who once shouted banzai in blind fury were building furniture, playing baseball, and learning English phrases from the very guards who had defeated them. They were supposed to despise these people, yet each passing day made that hatred harder to hold. What began on the decks of the USS West Point had now settled into routine. The Japanese had entered captivity expecting death. Instead, they found a life that chipped away at fear, one breakfast, one laugh, one film reel at a time. And for men like Cato, who lay awake listening to the hum of a radio in the guardhouse, the realization was impossible to escape. The Americans did not need to terrify them anymore. They had already won something far more permanent, their trust. The first time the gates opened for work detail, silence fell over the barracks. No one knew whether it was a trick or the beginning of some cruel march. Yet when the trucks rolled up, painted in olive green with open beds, the guards spoke calmly. They were being sent to help with the harvest. Cato sat stiffly in the back of the truck, hands folded, staring at the passing fields. Corn stretched in tall green rows, soybeans swayed in the breeze. The countryside of Wisconsin looked nothing like the war-torn jungles he had left behind. The air smelled of earth, not smoke. Birds sang without fear. When the truck stopped, farmers waited with hats pulled low, their wives standing back with baskets. The guards stepped aside. Prisoners climbed down, unsure of how to move in this new landscape. For many, it was the first time since capture they were beyond the fences. The farmers didn't shout. They didn't strike. They handed tools, hose, baskets, gloves. One farmer even pointed with a smile as if instructing a hired hand. And then it began. Rows of men in worn uniforms working shoulder to shoulder with American soil under their boots. The sun was heavy, the labor real, but food and water were plentiful. At midday, the women brought out sandwiches, apples, pitchers of lemonade that glistened with condensation. The guards ate. Then, after a pause, they gestured for the prisoners to eat too. Cato hesitated. The thought of taking food directly from an American family was unbearable, not from fear of poison anymore, but from shame. And yet, when a farmer's daughter, no older than 10, approached, offering him an apple with her small hands, something broke. He bowed awkwardly and accepted. The girl giggled at the formality, running back to her mother. By evening, the prisoners were exhausted, but astonished. They had expected suspicion, hatred. Instead, they found themselves treated almost as laborers on contract. When the trucks rolled back into camp, the men spoke in hushed tones. "They do not look at us like beasts," one said. Another murmured, "If our people saw this, they would not believe it." Over the weeks, the routine became natural. Trucks left camp at dawn, returned at dusk. In fields, barns, and orchards, the lines between captor and captive blurred. Farmers spoke slowly, teaching English words. Corn, wheat, apple, good job. Prisoners taught them Japanese in return. Laughter replaced suspicion. Letters from home began to echo the same theme. Cities bombed, food scarce, fear constant. Families wrote of ration cards, blackouts, children crying from hunger. And yet the prisoners were eating full meals, drinking coffee, gaining weight. The irony burned. Some felt guilt, others felt relief. For most, the shame of capture began to dissolve into gratitude that at least they lived. The guards noticed something striking. Discipline became easier. not harder. Prisoners worked willingly, sometimes even volunteering for extra shifts. Escape attempts grew rare. Why run into a country where even civilians treated them better than their own officers once had? There were moments, though, when the strangeness cut deep. One autumn afternoon, as leaves turned gold and the chill of northern winds carried across the fields, Cato overheard two American farmers talking. They spoke casually, like men trading gossip about sons fighting in the Pacific. One said his boy was stationed on Saipan. Another spoke of letters from New Guinea. The words pierced like a bayonet. The sons of these kind farmers might be the same men Cato's comrades had killed or who had killed his own. And yet when the day ended, the same men slapped him on the back, handing him an extra sandwich for the ride home. How could an enemy live in two forms at once, ruthless on the battlefield, generous at the dinner table? In the camp itself, transformations multiplied. Baseball diamonds were carved into open fields. At first, the game made no sense. A bat, a ball, bases that seemed arbitrary. But guards explained, demonstrated. Prisoners mimicked the movements, then grew competitive. By the second summer, Japanese teams played Americans in full games, laughter echoing across the wire as if war existed only in memory. Evenings became cultural exchanges. A prisoner who had once been a music teacher found a violin. Another carved shamisen-like instruments from scrap wood. Guards brought harmonicas. Songs mingled, Japanese folk melodies blending with American country tunes. For the first time, the POWs discovered what it felt like not to be feared, not to be hated, but to be part of something shared. But perhaps the greatest shift came with the newspapers. American guards sometimes left papers in the mess hall. At first, the Japanese avoided them. Then, curiosity won. They read of Allied advances, of island after island falling, of cities in flames back home. Yet, alongside the grim news were stories of ordinary life. Baseball stars, elections, crime in small towns, a world not consumed by hatred, but driven by routine. Cato found himself staring at photographs of smiling families in Chicago, advertisements for new refrigerators, pictures of school children. It was impossible to reconcile with the vision painted in imperial propaganda of Americans as savages without culture or honor. Here on the printed page was proof of something entirely different, a society vibrant, prosperous, and strangely free. The prisoners began to talk openly, not of escape, but of what life might be after the war. Could they return home and tell their families of what they had seen? Would anyone believe them? Would they even be allowed to speak? One night, as snow began to fall, Cato sat near the barracks stove with Yamashita. "Do you fear them still?" Cato asked. Yamashita shook his head slowly. "On the battlefield? Yes. But here, no. How can I fear a man who hands me bread when I am hungry?" Silence hung in the air. They both knew the truth. The Americans had destroyed their fear, not with guns, but with kindness that demanded nothing in return. By 1944, the camps no longer felt like cages. They were strange, yes, they were filled with longing for home, but they were not places of terror. Many prisoners began to dread not captivity, but the day it would end, the day they would have to return to a homeland where food was scarce, families shattered, and the future uncertain. For Cato, the realization was as heavy as it was liberating. The enemy had become human, and once an enemy is human, fear dissolves. Respect replaces hatred, curiosity replaces anger. And in those quiet Wisconsin nights, as snow blanketed the barbed wire fences, men who had once been willing to die rather than surrender, now prayed the war would last just long enough for them to remain where they had unexpectedly found peace. The winter of 1944 pressed hard against the fences. Snow fell thick, muffling the world beyond the wire. But inside the barracks, the stove glowed red, and the air was heavy with steam from cooking pots. For men who had expected starvation, captivity had become a strange paradox. They were eating more, weighing more, even laughing more than at any time since leaving home. For Cato, this winter marked the turning point. He awoke one morning to the sound of boots crunching on ice, guards bringing in the day's deliveries. The food crates opened, flour, sugar, tins of fruit, even coffee beans. He stared at the abundance and felt a pang of disbelief. He remembered his mother's last letter before capture, written in a trembling hand. She had described lines stretching for hours outside rice shops, rations barely enough to keep the family alive. And here in the land of the enemy, food was measured not in ounces, but in excess. At dinner that evening, Yamashita leaned across the table. "Do you realize," he whispered, "I've gained 20 pounds since arriving. My trousers no longer fit." The men chuckled, slapping his back, but the truth weighed on them. They were thriving in captivity while their country starved. Then came the newspapers. The guards left them deliberately now, aware that the prisoners devoured every word. Headlines shouted of American advances. Leyte Gulf, the Philippines, B-29 raids over Tokyo. The war map in the mess hall, once colored in bold swaths of Japanese red, shrank week by week as black pins marked the advance of Allied forces. Cato studied those maps obsessively. Every island lost was another step closer to home, another reminder that the empire he had once sworn to die for was crumbling. He remembered the speeches of his officers, the promises of victory, the assurances that Japan's spirit would overcome America's machines. But here, surrounded by America's machines, trucks, tractors, radios, endless crates of supplies, the lie was undeniable. Spirit alone could not fill bellies, it could not replace factories, it could not shoot down squadrons of flying fortresses. The men argued late into the night. Some clung to old loyalties. "Japan cannot be beaten," one insisted. "We will rise again." Others, quieter but more numerous, shook their heads. "Open your eyes. We are beaten already." Yet it was not despair that dominated. It was curiosity. If America could feed its prisoners so well, what must life be like for its citizens? How could such a nation be defeated? In spring, work details resumed. The snow melted, rivers swelled, and the trucks rolled again to farms and orchards. This time, the prisoners noticed what they had not before, the ease with which Americans lived. A farmer's barn contained tools more advanced than anything in their army depots. Tractors plowed fields in hours that would take men days. Children rode bicycles with chrome handlebars. Women wore dresses in bright colors. Radios played music in kitchens as if war were a distant inconvenience. One afternoon, while stacking hay bales, Cato overheard a farmer's wife humming a tune from the radio. It was lively, playful, nothing like the martial anthems drilled into him since youth. Without thinking, he found himself tapping his foot to the rhythm. She caught him, laughed, and hummed louder. In that moment, the enemy ceased to be faceless. She was simply a woman keeping her household, a mirror of his own mother in a world untouched by hunger. Back in camp, the cultural exchanges deepened. The guards encouraged plays, concerts, even debates. The Japanese prisoners staged kabuki-inspired performances. The Americans clapped enthusiastically, asking questions, even trying on costumes. In return, the prisoners watched baseball games under floodlights, cheering and booing as if the scoreboard mattered. What struck Cato most was the freedom of it all. Here, men spoke without fear of censors. Guards complained openly about politics, joked about the president, criticized generals, and suffered no punishment. To prisoners raised in a nation where dissent meant prison, this openness was both bewildering and intoxicating. By summer 1945, the world inside the fences had become unrecognizable. The prisoners were no longer driven by fear of punishment or shame of capture. They had been reshaped slowly into men who no longer trembled at the thought of their captives. Some even sought out the guards for conversation, asking about American families, about states they had never heard of: Kansas, Oregon, Alabama. And then the atomic bomb fell. The news rippled through camp like a thunderclap. Hiroshima destroyed in an instant. Tens of thousands dead. Even the most defiant prisoners fell silent. For days, the barracks was heavy with grief and disbelief. Men whispered about relatives in the city, about the meaning of such a weapon. Some wept openly. Yet when the second bomb struck Nagasaki and Japan announced its surrender, the reaction was more complex. There was sorrow, yes, but also a profound release. The endless speeches, the impossible promises, the demand for death over defeat, all of it had collapsed in a single week. The empire was gone. And with that collapse, fear of America vanished completely. What was left to fear? The victors had fed them, clothed them, sheltered them. They had shown mercy where none was expected. Now they wielded a weapon that could erase a city in a flash. Yet still they offered prisoners cigarettes and coffee with breakfast. Cato sat on his bunk, staring at the ceiling as the announcement spread. They would soon be repatriated. For the first time in years, he felt no dread of the Americans around him. Instead, he felt dread of leaving. He thought of the farmer's daughter with the apple. He thought of baseball games, of music shared under the stars, of laughter in the mess hall. He thought of full meals, warm clothes, and the astonishing realization that his captors had treated him better than his own officers once had. That night, Yamashita said what many were thinking. "I no longer fear them. I fear going home." It was not treason. It was truth. The Americans had broken the prisoners. Fear not through cruelty, but through an overwhelming display of strength combined with unexpected humanity. It was a weapon more devastating than bombs. Kindness in the face of hatred. And as August turned to September and preparations began for transport ships to carry them back across the Pacific, the prisoners lay awake in their bunks, wondering how they would ever explain to their families what it meant to live in the land of the enemy and lose not their lives, but their fear. The announcement of repatriation spread through the camp, like a shiver through tall grass. Men stopped in the middle of their baseball games, froze in the barracks with half-tied boots, let spoons rest in bowls of stew as the word sank in. The war was over. They were going home. For weeks, the prisoners had lived in limbo, suspended between surrender and departure, watching as guards relaxed their routines, as newspapers no longer carried headlines of battles, but of peace treaties and reconstruction. For many, the idea of home had become almost mythological. They had carried it like a talisman through captivity, believing it would give meaning to their suffering. Yet now, with ships ready to take them back across the Pacific, home was not only distant, it was frightening. Cato sat at his bunk that night, staring at the duffel bag issued to each man. Inside were basic supplies, clothes, toiletries, food for the journey. Neat, orderly American. He thought of the last time he had carried a bag in uniform, setting out for war with a heart full of conviction. That boy was gone. In his place sat a man whose life had been rewritten inside barbed wire. Around him, conversations buzzed in low voices. Some spoke with excitement, eager to see wives and children again. Others were grim, dreading what awaited them in cities rumored to be nothing but ash. A few admitted what many feared to say aloud. They did not want to leave. The final weeks in camp became surreal. Guards shook hands, posed for photographs with the prisoners, exchanged small gifts. An American sergeant pressed a pack of cigarettes into Yamashita's hand and said, "For the ship, you'll need them." Another gave away his baseball glove to a prisoner who had fallen in love with the game. What began as an arrangement of captor and captive ended as something stranger, something that neither side fully knew how to name. Departure day came in early October. The camp gates swung open for the last time. Trucks lined up in neat columns and guards called names from lists. Men climbed aboard with bags slung over their shoulders, turning to look back at barracks that had once seemed like cages, but now felt almost like home. Cato's truck jolted forward. He gripped the wooden rail, watching the camp recede, the baseball diamond, the guard towers, the mess hall chimney still trailing smoke. Memories flickered like photographs. The farmer's daughter with her apple, the harmonica at night, snow falling on barbed wire. For all its strangeness, for all its contradiction, this place had been the safest years of his adult life. At the port, the sight of the ships waiting brought a lump to his throat. Gray-painted hulls, gangways stretching like bridges, sailors calling orders. The ocean smelled sharp and endless. Prisoners filed up the ramps in silence, the weight of departure pressing heavier than their duffel bags. The voyage was long, rougher than their arrival years before. This time they were not young soldiers bound for conquest, but defeated men returning to ruins. Yet the ships were stocked with American efficiency, hot meals, medical checks, bunks with clean sheets. Some men tried to laugh at the irony. Even in defeat, the enemy ensured their comfort. Others sat in silence, staring out at the horizon, as if hoping the sea would answer questions their hearts could not. When Japan finally appeared on the horizon, it was not the home they remembered. Cities lay flattened. Docks were scarred. Smoke still rose from industrial ruins. The air smelled not of harvest, but of dust and hunger. Families waited on the docks, thinner, older, eyes hollow from years of rationing. Cato stepped ashore with a heart pounding like a drum. His mother stood waiting, clutching a scarf around her shoulders. He embraced her, feeling her bones beneath the fabric, so fragile he feared she might break. She wept, not just from joy, but from relief that he had lived when so many had not. Yet, as the days passed, reality set in. Food was scarce. Work was scarce. The emperor's voice had declared surrender, but the humiliation of defeat hung over every conversation. Neighbors whispered of shame. Men who had returned from other fronts kept silent about their time in camps, fearful of being accused of weakness. Cato tried once to explain to his mother what life had been like in America. The food, the kindness, the laughter, but she looked at him as though he were speaking a forbidden language. "Do not say such things," she whispered. "Others will not understand." He learned quickly that silence was safer, and yet in his mind the memories lived on. He dreamed of baseball diamonds, of coffee steaming in tin mugs, of music drifting through camp windows. He remembered how his fear of Americans had dissolved, how he had learned to see them not as demons, but as men. In the years that followed, Cato built a life in a Japan struggling to rebuild. He worked, married, raised children. But whenever he heard laughter echoing across a schoolyard or caught the smell of bread baking from a shop, he was pulled back to those unlikely years when the enemy became his teacher, his neighbor, almost his friend. Yamashita wrote to him once years later. The letter was short, cautious, written in formal phrases. At the bottom, though, a single line broke through. "I still dream of the camp. I still dream of the nights we did not fear." Cato folded the letter carefully, placed it in a drawer, and never spoke of it to anyone. Some truths were too heavy for a defeated nation to bear, but deep inside he knew. Fear had left him in those years behind barbed wire, and though he carried silence in his homeland, the memory lived on that the war had taught him something no officer ever could. The enemy's greatest power had not been its guns, but its capacity to treat captives as men. For Japanese POWs who returned, life in America became a secret chapter of their lives, one they carried quietly, one that could not be spoken aloud in a society built on sacrifice and shame. But in the privacy of memory, many admitted the same truth. They had lost everything in war except their lives, and in losing their fear of America, they had found, in the strangest way, a path back to humanity.